Good afternoon, and welcome to the third annual and first ever virtual Leadhers Summit hosted by Health Haven Hub, which is powered by Health Venture. Today's event is the closing event of the summit, which is a webinar presented by the Women of Color Capital Collective. True Disruption, Ensuring Equitable Distribution of Capital to Women of Color Throughout the Venture Ecosystem. I will introduce Donna M. Leckie, co-founder of the collective, who will also be moderating and presenting the discussion. Donna Leckie is a seasoned corporate executive, tax attorney, and accountant, venture capitalist, and entrepreneur. In addition to co-founding Health Venture, she leads our venture fund and investment process as managing director of Health Venture Capital. She brings over 25 years of experience in law, finance, restructuring, and due diligence to work with founders on strategy planning, business development, and team management. Most recently, she was chief tax officer and tax counsel at Omnicare, now a CVS health company. She was part of the deal team that worked on the $13 billion sale of Omnicare to CVS in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Donna Leckie to the stage.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome everyone. I would like to welcome and thank you for joining us for the third annual Leaders Summit 2021, a Health Haven Hub event powered by Health Venture. The Leaders Summit is an exclusive global event where we showcase women and women-led or co-led firms to key stakeholders within the entrepreneurial ecosystem. We are committed to advancing the roles of women in leadership, healthcare, technology, and venture capital. The summit features women in technology and supports female founders in the design and development of their innovations. Yesterday, during our fireside chat with Asahi Pompey, Global Head of Corporate Engagement and President of the Goldman Sachs Foundation, and Shannon Sartin, Chief Technology Officer, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, we discussed investing in women and other underrepresented groups, particularly in the Black
the future because they have better insight than this white guy does. And because we don't all understand the world in the same way. We all have unique insights, and women of color have unique insights that are currently not being tapped. And our communities are being underserved in many areas because of that. So I think it's on investors to kind of change their lens, to be more to help with this process of getting these founders more successful. And I think women of color fund managers will have, if we can get them built up, they will do that. I think it will be part of how they operate.
As part of the collective, and some of the things that we discussed, to your point is, as an investor, have you studied research on the performance of diverse managers? How many women of color own asset management firms, meaning at least 51% ownership, are currently in your database? And what is the breakdown by asset class? How many women of color owned investment management firms have you recommended to all of your clients? And how much by way of total assets does this account for? Do you even track diversity at women owned asset management firms? And how many women owned asset management does your fund currently invest with? And what is the average asset allocation for all recommended investment management firms? And so I think those are, as we've talked about it in our meetings, as we formed the group and formed sort of our thesis around this. These are things that we know we could help support our partners, the investment community, with tackling, so that we can again deal with the systemic issues that absolutely need to be changed. But at the same time, there has to be that education. And I think that education is more on the part of making sure that our investment community really understands what we're dealing with here. And I mean, the numbers are clear, the statistics are clear, and maybe there's just an opportunity for them to have a forum to really talk about some of the biases that investment firms are seeing, and really unpacking that so that they can better have an understanding, having an opportunity to have the dialogue, because, maybe, frankly, we shouldn't presuppose that the dialogue opportunity is there. So I think that that's one of the things that we talk about, how the collective can support, and what we intend on doing, working again with investment partners, is to drive home that opportunity to really make a systemic change. And I want to talk, Christy, a little bit about
and what can you do with $10 million in venture capital? Not a lot. And so the problem is that because these women have such small funds, it's hard for them to attract meaningful capital. It's hard for them to attract institutional capital. It's hard for them to get the capital to even have a proven track record. So 90% of women-led funds in general are considered emerging funds. And so how do we progress that notion? And we know that women are more likely to invest in other women. And so the pipeline effect is that essentially we're not fueling the ecosystem in a meaningful way because we don't have enough capital back us, which means our communities are not getting the capital. And that's the problem that we as a collective are trying to solve. We know that women, particularly women of color, are the future. And if we don't fuel this future, if we don't try to impact the wealth gap that we're having, we'll be left behind. And so this is the vast problem that the collective is trying to solve by leading with women of color, representing women of color. We want to represent our own voice in this space. We are women in technology. We do exist. We are here. And we're here to claim that and lead in our own authentic ways. Thank you. So I'm particularly talking about the muscle of private equity that is venture capital, that is focused on tech. So you have an industry where you have less than 1% representation of Black or Latinx in technical roles, less than 1% in executive level positions in these companies. You have less than 1% of women of color founders in this industry, and you have less than 1% asset managers. So essentially, there is a lack of exposure and access to these industries. And because of that, that also permeates this sense of I can do that and I can be there, because we don't see people who look like us there in every single facet of this ecosystem. And so it's hard to break in. If you look at some of the top Black women in venture, they're from non-traditional roles. They're not from Silicon Valley. They didn't come from tech. They don't have an MBA from Ivy League school. They're just people committed to solving this problem of lack of representation in this area. And so we have to give more, we have to look broader to get what we need to execute on how we need to execute. Yes, I'm in the amen corner here to everything you just said, Vanessa. But the problem is they're missing us, that they're missing a whole demographic of people in their boardrooms, on their boards, in their advisories, in their consultant teams. We're not there. And so when we present our problems that may be unique to us or our communities, they don't understand it. They don't have a pattern that matches that or understand. So a lot of companies I invest in, white boys aren't co-investing with me because they don't get why Black boys are a market we should serve. They don't understand Black women hair care in the beauty industry, how it's a $1 billion industry. They don't get what we do and how we do it and why we do it. It's foreign to them. And because no one is close enough to them explaining our experiences, explaining our circumstances, explaining how we do what we do and why we do it, it's risky. it's risky, and they don't have a team in place to help understand that, right? These are a team of professionals who have subject matter experts in all these verticals that help consult and advise them on good deal flow. And they don't have anybody to pick their brains with. This is out of their network. And so it definitely makes them uncomfortable to attack some of the problems that particularly women and women of color are attacking. And they're definitely problems that need to be solved. We have many more problems besides dating apps to solve in this society that are important and critical and need to be addressed.
What's the VC need to do? Other than things that Vanessa just outlined.
Yeah, so one, VCs are supported by an entire ecosystem. So they have to find talent for their portfolio companies. And so one way to build wealth in future investors is to employ people of color into the executive positions of the companies that's in their portfolio. That's one way, because they'll IPO and they'll create wealth, and they can then become entrepreneurs themselves or start their own funds. Like, that's one pipeline. The other thing is, obviously, we can't measure these communities the same way we measure everybody else, because they don't have the same access and tools. We need to look at our partnerships. Like, let's set some metrics around who are limited and general partners and managing directors in our funds. I only know one fund that has more than 5 Black and Latinx women as managing partners and limited partners. Like, essentially, even if you are a women-led fund, most of your funders are white, and that's because of the lack of the wealth gap that we have in society. But essentially, we need to diversify our partners, because they work to serve their partners. And so, we have more constituents in the game talking about the type of portfolio, type of investments that they want to make, and that where they want their money to go, right? That will fuel the ecosystem. And we also need, institutional investors to help amplify the investment in capital for these smaller funds. So they are limited in what they can invest, but if you get a big institutional investor to put some capital, more people will follow them. This is a follow the leader type of industry. So if one person does it, somebody has to go first. More capital will flow, right? And so I think we need more of VC decision makers to be courageous and bold and make statements, even though this is not a philanthropic cause by any means. Like, to say this is what we're going to invest in and we're committed to it, and it kind of demystifies and makes it okay for everybody else to play
themselves in that particular area.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest detriment to a person of color raising is valuations. And as soon as you present a product and show your face, you get devalued. And you think, you would hope that what you're presenting and what you're producing could stand merit on its own weight. But as soon as they take a look at who you are and where you're from, you get devalued. May any Black or brown founder be blessed like Clubhouse to get $1 billion valuation only on one platform, in a matter of months. No, that doesn't happen for our community. Many times women of color are saying they have $5 million companies, and people are like, maybe that's $1 million. And so the detriment that has is that these companies essentially get less capital, and when they try to exit, they're valued significantly smaller than other companies that may be doing the exact same thing. I can tell you stories of founders who have the same companies. One is Black and one is white, and the white one is propelling, even if it's a poorer product and doesn't perform and has all these flaws in it, has more capital and gets it faster, and it's able to scale faster and build that company faster. And to me, that is the detriment of you showing up to a boardroom looking the way you look, the color that you are, and the skin that you live in, and saying, my company is valuable and it is worth X, Y, and Z. And you spend your time, particularly entrepreneurs, trying to raise money for their companies, they spend their time defending that statement and that valuation. And so when you have these funds trying to invest in these funds, that essentially these companies are getting lower money, and the funds are like, well, these companies aren't that valuable, and your exits aren't that great, and your track record isn't performing because your companies are being devalued. That's what's happening.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we talk about these issues and trust and you know, there, I'm sure that there are people in the audience that feel that passion.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many things. But a lot of this reluctance, really, it's what you all said about being a woman of color, recognizing the markets, and then what Vanessa said about the high risk. So balancing, what to do. But I still am reminded, and I encourage people to, look it up if they're interested. Um, Really, a lot of these investors should be rating some of these long stalwart type companies that have Black women that have created products, hold patents, have created concepts and ideas that are buried underneath these companies. Um, there's a lot of reluctance because of high risk, but they weren't reluctant to bleed red ink for Amazon for 8 years. Amazon was not, successful year one or two or three or four. And so there had not even been the concept of what Amazon is. And now no one, no one remembers that. And so the next level investment, the next opportunity, the 21st century, dare I say the 22nd century, they have to find a capacity to um, look at those markets, identify successful traits in a business person. If they want to pattern match, look at those traits and what women of color carry those traits versus, well, we've not seen anyone yet that's done that particular type of product or service.
Mhm.
And Cynthia, I want to get your perspective from the founders. What do the founders need to do?
I saw a lot of questions about that too, Donna, in the chat. Um, Briefly, as a founder, you have to be clear and confident on the problem that you're trying to solve. While pivoting is a thing that's discussed, you want to go in focused on what the problem is, what you're trying to solve, the value your product has for the market, and also as a founder, be aware of what you don't know and try to shore that up. And so I have some suggestions that I utilized when I was often going. So many times I went to events, networking events. I was the only person of color, let alone a Black woman. So one, if you don't already, define your core support network. Who are people that will vouch for you if you are unproven? You're asking investors to invest millions, maybe starting small and then consequently more and more. Who are the people that'll vouch for you? Who are the people you can illustrate that you've executed before? Put them in what I call the support network. The second network would be your resource network. Your resource network may not be, maybe a crossover, maybe unique people that you met in some other capacity. Maybe on a vacation, you met someone who you really connected with. Former coworkers, clients, when you were freelancing. Identify who that resource network is where you can ask questions, get staff or recommendations on different elements that you're not as shored up on, and use that network as you see fit. But one thing I will say, respect your network. So when someone does make an introduction for you, you better be prepared. And I say that because I actually did that before. I made an introduction for a high level VC in Silicon Valley. They, to Vanessa's point, they had pedigree, they had experience, they even had money, and they failed miserably. Miserably. I was stunned. Don't do that. Practice in the mirror, practice with your support network. Ask, do the pitch, so many pitches online that you can do now and post COVID, go to places where you can do it in front of a live audience. Um, Not only do you hurt yourself, and that could reverberate in the investor world, but you also just hurt a potential relationship that person did for you, extending their network. And so those are some of the things that I would say to get started as a founder. If you don't have traction, look to your network and start compiling successes for yourself, so you can pull those in the form of people who are vouched for you, examples of work you've done, and even clients, a great application of your product or service, and a client that will vouch for that product. So you can start to show your ability to deliver on these investments.
You know, I was looking at the questions in the chat, and I want to thank everyone for those questions. So they're very insightful questions, and a lot of, I think, of which we've hit some of the highlights on. And this is not our first discussion. You will see more of the collective because we are dedicated to this work. And someone asked sort of what is the ask? And so of course, you know, we're all professional women here, and we do have a call to action. And I would ask Sharon if you could put up the final slide. The opportunity. You know, we talked about sort of the policies, and you alluded to, you know, some of the legal issues earlier. And so, you know, I think about like what we're seeing these days are like diversity riders and term sheets and things of that sort. And you're you know, although you and I are both attorneys, you're definitely on the side of, okay, let's just step back and make sure that we're in compliance, and let's understand the rules, and then we can move from there. I want to talk to you about, I want you to share your perspective for the collective on sort of the policies and what type of guidelines should be adopted to invest in emerging VC funds that are operated by women of color. Christy, I don't know if you
So I would like to, I think I'll step back a bit and say that, you know, attending events like such as this one and kind of broadening our networks is a crucial first step that we can all take. So I want to, you know, thank everybody that's for the gift of their time this morning. It's Saturday morning, and you probably could be doing a whole bunch of other things, and so we appreciate your being here and, you know, kind of listening to what we have to say. In terms of policies, I mean, I think I've alluded to you know, some that are more like in the laws, in addition to the one I mentioned regarding the requirement for accredited investors, which I mean, I know there's been some changes in that law, but that's kind of the way it's been for many years, and that's kind of how we get to the system that we are today. I think we also know that there's laws that kind of require institutional, you know, that put limitations on how much institutional investors can invest in a particular fund, right? For instance, it's capped to, like, I think, is it 10%? Correct, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but like 10% of the full fund size. So let's say CalPERS wants to invest in Donna's fund. They're limited by law to not be able to invest more than 10% of the assets that, you know, Donna's organization currently has under management. So there's those legal considerations, but beyond which many people are now kind of working on trying to solve some of those. But there's also kind of like the policies within, you know, established by the investors themselves, and many of these, you know, they don't necessarily have to be set in stone. It's kind of the way things have been done for a long time, and so people kind of go that. I don't think it needs to be that much different from investing in other VC fund. As Vanessa mentioned, I mean, most investors have like a target, a focus. You know, they're focused on AI, they're focused on healthcare. And so that's not something that they're necessarily going to change. And so the normal due diligence process, of course, still has to apply. But in terms of the size requirements and kind of all the other things that aren't necess- aren't required by law, and it's just the way that we've done it. I think that if investors took a look at those things and figured out the things that are absolutely necessary and the things that are not, using the analogy of like firefighters, there used to be requirements that firefighters have to be 6 foot tall and whatever weight and so on and so forth. Well, most women aren't 6 foot tall, so that basically, and then we find that being 6 foot tall really doesn't have anything to do with how effective you will be in fighting fires. So I think it's that kind of mindset that we have to kind of apply, especially with regard to how much track record and how much assets under management the organization has to have in order to be to be deemed investment worthy.
And so we've got about 13 minutes left in the discussion, and I want to make sure that we get some of the questions and additional questions in from the audience. But Chrissy, what do you think?
Yes, so I think the answer to this is the same as any other industry, whether it's Hollywood or basically any other industry. So, others have mentioned, the lack of connections and awareness. I think we all know that we like to do business and partner and employ and basically connect with people that we feel comfortable with, right? People that we can see ourselves knocking back a beer with, even in the business context. And it may not be obvious to us that that's what we're doing. So I think that that comfort level is part of it, and also just knowing people, having those connections, reaching out beyond one's kind of immediate circle. Even though like venture investing is, by definition, a risky venture, right? There is a certain risk averseness, which is what leads to this, pattern recognition issue that we've all, that we've all kind of talked about and we all know about, where, okay, I know I found a fish in this particular pond, so the next time I go fishing, I'm gonna go just to that pond. I'm not gonna try any other ponds. And despite all the data to the contrary, there's also confirmation bias, right? There's so much data showing that, as you mentioned, that diversity actually leads to better results. But people take the data that supports what they already believed to start with, and anything that doesn't support that is kind of dismissed as an outlier. This might be, people may not be conscious that they're doing this, which is part of it. But I think those are all kind of the reasons why we're in this situation.
Yeah, because the implication is that women of color are not seen as viable investments. That's really sort of what it boils down to, right? And so who sits at the decision-making table matters. Fiduciaries know very well their obligation is to make decisions that are in the best interest, financial interest of their institutions. And often this fiduciary obligation is cited to justify a lack of investment with Black and Brown and women asset managers. It is clear that women of color fund managers are missing what they're missing. We just talked about them, lack of access, capital advocacy, and the rest of it. But what is the investor community missing? Why are they reluctant? Vanessa?
Yeah, I think the VC community is a high risk venture to begin with, and so I think what happens is we have the biases against women of color, in that they're not as qualified, or they don't have the good ideas. They obviously don't have the network, and therefore they're perceived as higher risk. And so if you add risk on top of risk, it's not something really attractive. the challenge is that, even for women of color, their successes are not really visible, nor are they promoted. And so there are successful, and there are many women of color out there who have huge potential to be successful. But when one fails, we all fail. So this is the challenge we have in these biases. So where by if a white man fails, it's that white individual who fails. When a person of color, a woman of color fails, the entire group fails. And that's the challenge of how these biases play in a very detrimental way. So I think that is one big aspect, and the perception of additional risk that women of color have ecosystem. And the analogy I draw to that is in my own journey to the boardroom, what I found out was it wasn't an issue of qualification, it was an issue of me not being part of the network. Because how board assignments occur is you have to be in that network, and it's people you know. So for me, one of the major issues is women of color are just not in the networks they need to be, and they're not included in development and opportunities related to those networks.
Okay. Leisha?
Yes, I call this the less than 1% problem.
The biases. And I want to talk a little bit more about how the biases manifest themselves. How do we see those biases? Vanessa?
Yeah, so Donna, I was, there's so many, like every time each of us talks, I think about more things to say, and like it brings ideas to me in terms of, oh, I need to mention that. But I think, for example, when we look at the VC ecosystem, I don't necessarily think it's more biased than any other part of our society, unfortunately. And so, yes, there is built-in bias into that component of our society, and I think that it manifests itself in the forms of perceiving women of color as, I hear things like not polished, not as smart, not well connected. They don't have enough experience. But that's always an interesting thing. How are you supposed to get experience if nobody ever gives you an opportunity to actually do something? So it's in the end, it's just the statement that they're not worth the risk. So that is, to me, a systemic challenge in our society. But really, and the whole point of the collective is we're trying to address this key component in our society, um, which really limits wealth creation for our communities. And that is, to me, we have to move up the food chain, so to speak, and we need to start working with uh, empowering, because I am more likely to support a woman of color founder because I know how much it takes to get to the place they're at, the struggle, the resilience needed, the barriers they've had to overcome. And that's the kind of people that you want, someone who's evaluating you. Maybe your PowerPoint isn't as fancy and polished as somebody else's, but your level of grit, your level of resilience is so much higher. And that is the kind of person I want to invest in.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I think about.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors working here. One is, quote, the pipeline conversation, which happens in multiple areas I've been involved in, including the boardroom, trying to make your way to the boardroom. The argument that there aren't enough investors. Not enough board ready women of color. And so I think that there's a bit of that working where I do think that, a VC firm might get a very specific area that they're investing in. For example, I work with Flying Fish Partners, and they focus specifically on AI and ML based companies. And so with that, the deal flow that you see is a little less than, in general, because that is kind of a very specialized space. And then on top of that, you definitely don't see, you see women not necessarily women of color that then you do, but you do see some Asian women. So you are seeing some diversity like in that very narrow space. I think that it's an aspect of also we need to, and this ecosystem needs to support women of color who are graduating that have these technical degrees to make their way into these ventures to help them be more successful. And I it's no question that there's the intelligence out there to do it. I think there's also an aspect of we need to promote them to take more risks. We need women of color to take more risks. And here's the reality. It's tough to do that because a lot of us, and I know this was my situation, we get out of college, and if we come from a family that doesn't have a lot of money, we are also the safety net for that family. So our jobs are important to our families in terms of their economic well-being. So we can't take those same risks in all situations. So this is part of like what we need to in the collective work with as well to help these we have to help these investors understand this ecosystem needs to be replenished at all levels. So we need to do more to help these entrepreneurs and we need to do more to develop fund managers. And I think if we have allies in the investor space who also believe in this and believe that we'll all get better together and we need to get better together, I think that will help. I think when investors do see a woman of color come in and present, I think they need to like realize that this might be the first or second time they've ever pitched, because people aren't accepting them to even see their pitches. They're not giving them that chance. So I think investors need to have a level of understanding that they will be nervous. They will not have the necessarily have it perfect. And but that doesn't mean they don't have a great idea or they don't have a great product or service. And somebody asked in the chat, what do VCs look for when they invest? Number one that I've heard on, or three things I hear. One is they look at the founders. Do they believe in those founders? Then it's the idea, and then is there a market for this idea? And so what I think is that investors need to relook at the founders. They need to really tackle their biases of the founders potentially. Like that when they see a woman of color walk in, they don't right away jump to the perceptions of, more risky, but maybe they jump to the perception that this person understands this component of the market better than anybody else I've talked to. They understand how this could be a really important revenue generating idea. Like this could make money in
capital. And I want to talk about that from the perspective of not only closing the gap from an institutional investor perspective, and Vanessa, I'd like you to weigh in on that as well. Also, from the perspective of how we look at this from actionable steps that an LP can take, and steps that founders can take, and operational practices that could be implemented to support closing those gaps. So I want to start with you, Cynthia, and then Vanessa, I'd like you to chime in on the institutional investor and closing the gap for women of color in VC. And then I'd like to hear from actionable steps that LPs can take and founders from both Christy and Cynthia. Vanessa?
Okay, so in terms of institutional investors, they obviously manage a large pool of capital, and only a smaller portion of their capital goes to the VC community, and that's mainly they tend to not put a large percentage in VC because it is higher risk. I think very simply, Donna, I think if an institutional investor really wants to make a difference, I think they should start holding these VC firms accountable, and asking simple questions like, how many diverse partners do they have, or considering these factors, how diverse are the companies the VC is investing in, What programs does the VC have in place to help the women of color entrepreneurs be successful? A lot of VCs are getting into the kind of this component of supporting their portfolio companies in development, and I think that it's super important for their own success. I think that that those kind of questions are things that the institutional investors should start asking. And it's no different. Again, I'll draw the analogy to what's happening in the boardroom around boardroom diversity. So the Goldman rule, Goldman Sachs holds, any company they take public must have at least one female board member. That is many people say, well, one that's horrible, just one, that's nothing. My point is, hey, before there were zero, now there's
Right.
one, and maybe next time there'll be two. And like, I mean, at least Goldman
It's a start.
taking us, at least they're doing something and doing, having some hard goals and accountabilities for these firms. And so I think that's kind of what has to happen in this space as well. Institutional investors who really care about this need to start holding VCs accountable.
Right, Leisha, what is the role of established VC in this need for change?